ready. Good morning, everybody. Nice to see you all this morning. Happy Wednesday. I hear tell that it's going to get a little cooler very soon. I'm very excited about that. I'm glad that we are here to look at John chapter 2. John chapter 2 is so good. Remember when I told you I was scared of John? It seems like every single week, I'm like, oh, this is a great chapter. So I'm kind of excited. This is a really good chapter, so I'm very excited about today. And we got a lot of questions during this past week, and so I'll try to address them. I think I've whittled them down to like 6. And so we'll do a few of them, and then we'll try to throw a few more in as we go through. But just a few announcements as we get started. A reminder that you can go back and listen to all kinds of podcasts at stmichael.org/RBS, which is Rector's Bible Study. There's a new podcast out where I am interviewing about once a month. I'm trying to interview leaders in Dallas, and there's video and audio, and I'd invite you to try them out. I think the second episode posted today, and we're calling it Practically Fearless, and that's kind of silly, but I like it, and the graphic is nice. And so if you go to stmichael.org/practicallyfearless, you can actually see these as they post each month, and I'll ask Buv to include that link in our next email. Speaking of Buv's emails, some people are still having trouble receiving her emails, and so if that is you, she is right there. And so go talk to her afterwards. She will help talk you through it. We think it's our system triggering some spam or junk filters, and so we can help you kind of talk through that on your end and hopefully clear out whatever problem or wall that you have. And then lastly, as we get started, do ask questions as we go because I love them. Let's get a prayer and we will kick it off. Oh, you know what? I lied. I had one more note that I was supposed to tell you. I'm out of town a couple times this year, and next week is one of them. And so Mary Lessman is teaching for me. Mary Lessman is a fantastic teacher, and sometimes I have not told you all when I'm leaving because people tell me they don't come if I don't teach, which is not okay. And so do come. Mary is great. You will love her. And this is one of a couple times I'll be gone this year. And so come and enjoy a different style because she is super. Now let's pray. Gracious God, we give you thanks for bringing us together this morning, and we ask that you open up our hearts and minds. We all carry a lot of weight and baggage with us every day, and I ask you to help us to put that down for the next hour. Let us put down those things that weigh on us, our stress and our anxiety, our worries, our concerns. Help us to put those aside and make space inside of our hearts and minds that your Spirit can fill us up. As we spend this hour considering the work that you have done in the past and the work that you continue to still do today, may we be courageous enough to be part of that work as we help build your kingdom here on earth. I ask you to bless all those we hold in our hearts and minds who need your presence most today, those especially who need your healing touch, and those who are facing trials, even the end of their lives. May they be uplifted by our prayers and your love. All this we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so we're going to start off with just a couple questions because I do think they are good questions. And so the first has to do with the difference between the Old and New Testament gods. And this is a great question that comes up at some point every single year because in the Old Testament, God appears to be quite intense. And one might say vengeful. And there are the ways in which stories are told that portray God as expecting us to do certain things, and if we don't do them, then we will be struck down. And there are a lot of people today that like to bring out that God whenever they want to manipulate and force people to do certain things. Here's the problem. The New Testament is not just about new writings. The New Testament is about a new covenant. It's about a new way of understanding God. Now, I say a new way of understanding God because it's not that God has changed. That's the fundamental idea. God is consistent, but how people understand God has changed. And so in the Old Testament period of time, which of course was centuries and centuries of time, people understood God in a particular way. And as Christians, we might be so humble as to say that misunderstanding was clarified in the person of Jesus. Now we have to be super careful about that because we don't want to be judgy. But in a big cosmic sense, Jesus came not to do something, not to change God, but to change our understanding of God. God was constantly trying to reach down and get attention of humanity over and over and over again. God was constantly trying to explain the kind of cosmic love and salvation story, but it wasn't until we found Jesus, or Jesus found us, it wasn't until Jesus came that we began to understand most completely what God had been trying to do. We will get a lot of that today because we'll be talking about what the temple actually was. The temple was before Jesus, and then what we understand the temple, in a sense, to be now after Jesus. And so that's good for there. Someone asked who the beloved disciple is. And beloved disciple is such a nice idea. We all likely have heard that phrase before, but that phrase is really only in the Gospel of John. And the beloved disciple is never pinned down clearly. The beloved disciple could be John the Apostle. It could be, some scholars have said it's Mary Magdalene. Some scholars have said it's Lazarus. Some have said it could be Thomas, and on and on and on. There are cases to be made that it could be multiple different people. I would say I like the idea that the beloved disciple is John, mostly because as an unnamed disciple, there's this sort of nod to humility, as if John the Apostle, who is telling the story and then people are writing the story down, is trying not to say, yeah, that was me. But in a sense, that kind of makes sense to me. That's about as far as we can go. The answer is we don't know for sure, but I think there are good arguments to be made that it could be one of many different people. Okay, let's keep going because I'm trying to bust these questions out real fast. What makes a gospel authoritative? And then there were 3 other questions about essentially what is canon. When the Bible was put together, who decided what was there? And so I know I've said this in many different ways, but I do want to give us like 60 seconds of this because I do think it's important for us to hear this multiple different ways. So over the first few decades, in that first century, people were trying to tell the story of Jesus. So that happened in multiple different ways. Yes, some people wrote gospels. Those were just stories of Jesus. Many people wrote letters to faith communities and Christian groups that were meeting in churches or houses or wherever. Those letters were then copied and recirculated because they were trying to answer very specific questions, and on and on. So you really have primarily story documents like the Gospels or Acts and letters trying to address specific ways that people were attempting to be good Christian disciples. Those were then copied and shared, and they were read aloud. Remember, most people weren't literate, and so those would have been copied and read aloud again and again and again. Well, fast forward about 100 years, and certain ones mattered to people more than others. So in the 2nd century, we get the beginning of people saying certain things are or are not authoritative. There are, in the first few centuries, trials, sort of, that pit one theological approach against another theological approach. And then what some church authorities would ultimately say is, one way is right and one way is wrong. And we have a special word for when someone has the wrong theology. They are a heretic. And so there were multiple different great heresies of the church. And there are plenty of better priests and scholars than me who can recall to you things like, I promise you, in seminary, we used to have, others had conversations where they'd be like, what's your favorite heresy? And I'm like, you laugh. I bet you most priests would be able to tell you their favorite heresy. I don't know. I was never that concerned because they figured all that out, and whatever I got taught was like all the right stuff and not the heresies. And so whatever. But there are, an example of a heresy would be, is Jesus human or is Jesus divine? And so some people said Jesus was fully one or fully the other. Well, they're not right. They're heretics. Some said that Jesus was half and half. Well, they're not right. They're heretics. And so the real truth is Jesus is fully 100% both, which mathematically is impossible, but it's God. So we're going to say yes. And so that's the kind of way in which heresies would have been vetted over those first couple centuries. So imagine all of that sort of stuff is happening. When we get to the 4th century, the 300s, there have been certain books, letters, that have risen to the top. And there was an important bishop named Athanasius who lived in Alexandria in Egypt. And Athanasius, in his Easter letter in 367, wrote about a specific set of books that were authoritative in understanding Jesus and understanding God through Christ. That is historically the earliest that we have the specific set of New Testament books that we hold as the New Testament identified in one place. A few decades later, in 382, there is a Council of Rome that takes that same list and affirms it as the authoritative books of the New Testament. That is reaffirmed over and over and over again until we get to the mid-1500s and the Council of Trent. The Council of Trent was called together in response to the reformers. So think Martin Luther and John Calvin and all the others. That Council of Trent was called together to say, this is really what the true church is about. And that's the point at which the Bible, as the Roman Catholic Church uses it, was nailed down, like published in a sense. It was like end to end, this is it. So we can go as far back as the 4th century to say the New Testament books, as we have received them, were basically in canonical order. But in the most official way, that was not really landed on until the 1500s. Okay. Good? Questions? Good. All right, so the last question I'm going to bring up is meant to get us into chapter 2. Where does the idea of the body being a temple come from? And does the Old Testament speak of the body as a temple the way that Paul in the New Testament speaks of the body as a temple? And that is a great question, because chapter 2 of John really deals with what is happening new in the person of Jesus from what had been before Jesus came. And one incredibly important idea rests in the identity of the temple. So before we get there, I do want to just close out the end of chapter 1 because I was sort of rushed last time we were together. So remember, it was the calling of the first few disciples. Today we're going to have 3 sections. We're going to recap the calling of the first disciples, then we're going to talk about the wedding in Cana, and then we're going to talk about the cleansing of the temple. So to just recap the calling of the first disciples, we know that in John's story, Andrew was one of John the Baptist's disciples. John the Baptist sent Andrew to follow Jesus. Andrew then went and got his brother, Simon Peter, so they were together. Then Jesus called both Philip and then Nathanael. When Jesus calls Nathanael, we have that funny exchange that actually we learn a bit more about today in chapter 2, where they say, we found the Messiah. He's from Nazareth. And Nathanael says, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Remember the snobby sister city thing between Nazareth and Cana? So Nathanael then goes to Jesus and says, and Jesus says, I know you. And Nathanael says, how do you know me? He said, I saw you sitting under the fig tree. And Nathanael's blown away and says, you must be the Lord. And Jesus says, if that impresses you, then just wait, because you're going to see a whole lot better stuff than that. And Jesus says, do you believe because I told you that I saw you under the fig tree? You will see greater things than these. Very truly, I tell you, you will see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man. This is very important phrase because Jews would immediately go back to Jacob and Jacob's ladder when Jacob met God. And did I read Genesis to you last week? We didn't get there, did we? Okay, good. If you don't remember, I'm going to do it again. Okay. What Jesus says to Nathanael immediately connects two dots. We've spoken many times before about the way in which stories are cast and told that intentionally harken back to other stories. And so when we have stories like in Luke, we talked about this years ago. Well, it's actually not in Luke, sorry. When did we talk about this? Oh, I remember what we did. When we talked about Exodus and Moses was set on the river in a basket to save him from Pharaoh trying to kill all the babies. And then I remember I asked you, where else do we have a story like this? And then, of course, we have the story like this in Matthew, where Jesus flees to Egypt. Well, Joseph takes Jesus to Egypt in order to skip out on Herod killing all the babies. We don't know that infanticide ever happened. So why would Matthew have told that story? Matthew's telling that story because he wants his readers to immediately understand Jesus is the new Moses. So just like that, we have a moment here where John is connecting a dot directly from Jesus to Jacob. And Jacob is super important. We often think of Abraham as kind of the father, which is fine because Abraham received kind of the first covenant moment. But Jacob becomes Israel. Jacob is literally renamed Israel. Jacob's 12 sons become the 12 tribes of Israel. So when it comes to Judaism, the Jewish people really anchor themselves on Jacob. Jacob is really critical. And so here, when Jesus says that you will see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending, he's hearkening back to Genesis chapter 28. In Genesis chapter 28, Jacob is on the run. He stops and he falls asleep. And he dreamed that there was a ladder set up on the earth, the top of it reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And the Lord stood beside him and said, "Your father Abraham and your father Isaac, this is the land on which I will give to you and to your offspring." And Jacob woke from his sleep and said, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." That moment begins to anchor God's presence on the earth, and that connects to the temple. And so that's all I need to say about chapter 1, that Jesus is beginning to introduce this idea of the way that heaven and earth connect by hearkening back to Genesis and the story of Jacob. Now he has recalled that story in the calling of Nathanael and will shift into this identity within the temple narrative, and we'll really get to that in the second half of chapter 2. I kind of don't know that I made that very clear. So is there a question to follow up with that? What I should say as you're thinking of a question, John does not write his gospel. No, I should say, John writes his gospel as like a map. John is showing us all the major stopping points on the map on his way to understanding that God is doing something totally different in Jesus. John's gospel is less a nice story and more specific. It's almost like steps on a path. John goes step, 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 step. And we know that the entire book of signs, that first half of John, is about 7 specific miracles that all point to God doing something different in the world through Jesus. And John does that in the first half, and then he pivots to show that Jesus is the fulfillment of all of these messianic prophecies in the second half. John is not interested in storytelling. Even though there are some good stories in John, and chapter 2 is one of those chapters, we don't get the kind of interesting story narratives that we get, especially in Luke. If you want a good story, read Luke. Luke's the one that gives you all the parables that are beautiful and people do paintings and all that sort of stuff. John's not that. You're not going to do a painting because of John. John is much more about imagery than stories. And all of John's images are meant to create a theological thread that points to Jesus doing something new. And he's beginning that right here in chapter 1 by recalling Jacob's ladder. Okay, I saw a question back there.
Chris reminded us of the city on the Son of Man. Just a quick definition of Son of Man as opposed to Son of God.
Yes. So asking about the phrase Son of Man. There are a few phrases that are used in the Gospels that are just simply favorites of the writer. And so, for example, we talk about the kingdom of God and the kingdom of heaven. Well, one is in Luke and one is in Matthew. Does it mean different things? Not really. But they say them a little bit differently. And so maybe there's a nuance in there that we can parse out, but it's not critical that they're so different. Son of Man, Son of God, they mean the same thing. In John, there is a direct understanding of Jesus's Christology. And so I know I've said this a few times. The Gospel of John has the highest Christology. It's the highest understanding of Jesus as Christ, not just Jesus as good teacher or miracle worker. In the Synoptic Gospels, in Mark, Matthew, and Luke, we get Jesus as good teacher. In John, we get Jesus as the Christ. And that high Christology, that high identity of Christ, rests on what Jesus is doing that connects the creation to the Creator. And so, Son of God, Son of Man, is really meant to say, in Jesus we get essentially this bridge between what is divine and what is earthly. Because ultimately, the Gospel of John is meant to encourage us to understand that we are responsible for reciprocating God's love, and as we reciprocate God's love, we actually bring heaven and earth together. So, John is one of those places where we get a pretty clear idea that heaven is not some other place. It's not the reward that you have to wait to get until you die. In John, heaven is really a place that can be realized now, because heaven is when the Creator and the creation come together completely. If that does not happen by the time you die, could you be in complete relationship and presence with God? Sure. I don't know about that. You don't know about that because you're still breathing. So we don't know exactly what happens after death. But the promise is that in a cosmic sense, we will be with God and completely with God. Resist the temptation to imagine heaven as being up there with people looking down on us. I mean, it humanizes what is divine way too much. If that is sweet and artistic or poetic, then great, knock yourself out. But theologically speaking, there is no city up in the literal clouds above our heads. Okay, we do realize that, right? I mean, just nod your head, yes, we're good. Okay, if you have a problem with that, or if you question that, then ask, because that is what we're taught. That was what I was taught. I mean, heaven's up there, look up, there's heaven. No, that's not. And it's confusing, because what then happens is you've got children like me who then go to school and learn about things like the solar system. And I remember thinking, where's heaven? I mean, it's nuts, right? And then when you go to church and they're like, no, it's there. And I'm like, where? Because I'm seeing the pictures of the earth and I don't see the heaven. Where is it? And so then it begins to cause people to say, one of these things is wrong. And so I will tell you, science is so much more convincing in literal explanations than religion. And so when religion tries to out literal science, it will lose. And so instead, let's look at what they're actually saying here. That's why we study the Bible. Jesus never says, look up, there's heaven. That never happens. And so that's just the church trying to make sense of what is divine, not human. And so for us to kind of live in that middle space where we can actually say, we don't know, we don't fully understand, someday we will. But right now, what we do know is that Jesus said to love, and when we love, we are actually bringing heaven and earth closer together. That's it. This is part of the whole, we don't really like it when Jesus tells us to do the things that are hard. And so we make up, I've said this before, someone said at one point to me that theology is just our attempt at making the simple stuff really complicated so we don't actually have to do it. And so that's really not what it is. Jesus just says love each other, and we don't really like that because people can be so profoundly unlovable, and so, including us, by the way. And so we like to put limits around that so that we don't really have to, or we can justify not for now, or whatever. And so because of all of that, we miss the super simple idea. I mean, look at the words of the Lord's Prayer. The Lord's Prayer simply says, "Can your will be done on earth as it is in heaven?" It's about bringing them closer and closer together. And they're brought closer together through the love that is embodied completely in the person of Jesus as the Christ for our good, on our behalf. Yeah.
What do you think of the book by Randy Alcorn called Heaven? Where it goes through and documents all the Old Testament and New Testament.
I don't know that book. Sorry. I don't know that book. So, no, you can tell me afterwards and I'll look into it. Yes.
In the Old Testament, one day a year on Yom Kippur, the priest is allowed to enter the inner temple and see and talk to God directly. In John, in the New Testament, everybody is able to talk to God directly. This is a cosmic shift, as it were.
Yeah, so the observation is, in Judaism, in the Orthodox Judaism in which Jesus was living, and in the Orthodox Judaism that still exists, there is this idea that the temple is the one place where we can actually go to be in God's presence. That is why Orthodox Jews pray at the Western Wall. When you go to Jerusalem, the closest, the closest a Jewish person can get to where the temple was, because of course the temple isn't there now, is a retaining wall that helps supports the Temple Mount. So this is not a wall of the temple. It's way below the Temple Mount. It was simply holding up the ground on which the temple had been built. It's the closest a Jewish person can get. So if you as a Christian person goes to Jerusalem, you can go through a series of security checks and be granted access to the Temple Mount. We cannot pray on the Temple Mount. We're not really supposed to teach on the Temple Mount, although they're sort of lax about that. But we can be there as Christians. Jews cannot. And so that's why Jews get as close as they can get if they believe that the temple is the one place where God is literally present. Now, the Jewish people most of us know here in America, they are progressive Jews. And so they're not overly concerned with this idea of God's only physically present in this one place in Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem is still important, but they've loosened up this idea of God's presence. And so if you go to a synagogue here in Dallas, there is a sense that God is present in one way. Fully, not fully. And so there is kind of a graduated presence of God, in a sense. Only the Orthodox Jews still believe that right there on the Temple Mount is the only place that God can be present on earth. Now, what Jesus is doing, and that gets us into chapter 2, so we're going to pivot now, is Jesus is completely overturning that idea. And so when we get to the second half of chapter 2 with the turning of the tables, Jesus is not only turning over tables physically, Jesus is turning over the entire idea of the way in which God is present to us. Because rather than God being limited to a physical space, God is now in everything because of Jesus. And so we're going to get there. Okay, let's pivot to chapter 2. Chapter 2 has one of my favorite stories. It is so good. The wedding at Cana is great. Let's just read it first, and then we'll jump in. Well, let me just, a word. This is the first of the 7 signs in this kind of first half of John, the book of signs. John is not attempting to write a historical account of Jesus. John's not attempting to write kind of this journalistic quality story of Jesus. Now, yes, he's piecing together things that Jesus likely did, sure, but John is not trying to give us all the stuff that Jesus did. John is jumping from one thing to another because John's trying to point very clearly to 7 signs. We can call them miracles, same difference. 7 signs that show Jesus is doing something new. So each of those signs is a miracle, yes. And each of those miracles turns the crystal of the same idea, and that is the Word has become flesh. We see it right away in verse 1 of the entire gospel. God's Word, the created energy of everything, has now become flesh to dwell among us. And so these signs point to that truth, that reality. And this wedding at Cana is where we get the very first sign. And we actually get John saying, this is the first sign. He says that for the first 2, and then we're left to our own devices. We can count. But this, he says, like, here's number 1. I'm going to tell you number 1. Let's keep going. Let's read chapter 2, the first 11 verses, because it's so good. Here we go. On the 3rd day, now why would he say on the 3rd day? That's interesting. Okay. On the 3rd day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and to me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now standing there were 6 stone jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, "Fill the jars with water," and they filled them up to the brim. He said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the chief steward." So they took it. When the steward tasted the water that had become wine and did not know where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the steward called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. But you have kept the good wine until now." Jesus did this, the first of his signs, in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Now let's place the story in historical context. So we already know Nathanael's from Cana, and so they're kind of going back to the good side of the tracks. The wedding at this point in time, like in many ancient cultures, took place over days and days and days. So this was not a, drop in and drop out like weddings can be here. This was something, when people had to travel, and sometimes travel for days, they stayed. And so a wedding feast was not a single meal. It would have been days of living together, eating together, dancing and drinking and all that sort of stuff. We see that now in cultures around the world. That's just not what happens here in America. And so part of what is meant to happen is the host family feeds all the people who come. So you've got to have a place to stay, you've got to have food to eat, you've got to have wine to drink. That is just how it's done. And so here at day 3, the wine has given out. And it is a major, massive embarrassment. It is highly likely that the people getting married are somehow related to Jesus and Mary. And so when Mary comes in and says to Jesus, "The wine is gone," Mary's not just being nosy. Mary is probably taking care of the family in one sense. Before I get into the mechanics of the story, just a side note. Wedding banquets, they are constantly used as images for God's kingdom. We will see this over and over again in the Gospel of John, that wedding banquets are used to describe the way in which God's kingdom works. Another way of putting that is the way in which God's economy on earth works. And so part of what happens here in Cana, yes, it's a miracle, cool. The water turns to wine, great. That is way not the point. The point is that Jesus' presence in this moment transforms the reality of the moment. That's what is really happening here. When people do what Jesus says to do, the world is transformed. Okay? That alone is powerful for us. And so let's talk about the mechanics of this story. So we know day 3, the wine is out. Mary comes to Jesus and says, they have no more wine. And Jesus says, so what's that got to do with me? I love this moment for what is not said. So I literally, last night, I knew I was teaching on this today. And so when I was putting my youngest to bed last night, I said, hey, grab your Bible. And we read through this story. And I said, now, she's 10. And I said, if mom came to you and said, they are out of wine, is she actually just informing you that they are out of wine? Or is she saying something else? And she smiled and she said, she'd be telling me to help. Yes, that's exactly right. So we know this look. Mary is not giving Jesus information. Mary is saying, do something about it. And so when Jesus says, what's this got to do with me? Okay, so how many of us would find our mothers receptive to that response? Right? So that's what I love about this, is I can just say, so I said to my youngest, if you had said that to mom, what would she have done? And I said, I'll tell you what she would have done. She would have done this. That's how she would have responded. And then what would you have done? And she said, I would have helped. And I said, yes, that's right. And so what I love about this moment is Mary does not even respond to Jesus. There is nothing said because Mary doesn't have to respond to Jesus. Mary just probably raises her eyebrows at Jesus, turns, and says, do whatever he says, because once again, help. I mean, that is what is that. I love that. I love this scene. It's great. This is the only time we get Mary in the entire Gospel of John, with the exception of her being at the foot of the cross. So this is it. This is all we get of Mary. There is no sweet like Gabriel moment or going to visit Elizabeth moment. We get none of that. In John, Mary is really meant to mark the beginning and the end of what Jesus is doing. And so when Jesus says, like all joking aside, when Jesus says, my hour has not yet come, what John wants us to hear super clearly is that he's come to do something profound, and it's not yet. And then the next time and only time we see Mary, that is the hour that has come. And so John very clearly shows that although the transformation has begun, the transformation is not complete until he is on the cross. And Mary helps us to see the beginning and the end of that cosmic salvation action. Okay, so then we know that Jesus says to the stewards, go fill the water jugs. Now, if you did the math, this is minimum 120 gallons of water, up to 180 gallons of water. This is a gigantic amount of water. And so these jugs were typically used for cleansing. So they would have been good quality jugs to be able to hold a ton of liquid. And so they go off and they fill these with water. And Jesus says, go draw water and give it to the steward. Here is what is very important for us to notice. This is not magic. Jesus does not wave his hand and it's wine. That's not what happens. Jesus tells a person or people to go do something. It is only when they go and they do that the impact happens. It's only when they go and they do that the transformation happens. What that tells us is something critical about the way that John understands God's work in the world through Christ. Jesus is not coming to do it himself. Jesus is coming to guide us in changing who we are and what we do, because it is through our change, our commitment, our actions, that is actually when Jesus' purpose is fulfilled. So my question to you is, was the water wine until the people drew it out? The way John tells the story, I think the answer is no. We get that kind of theology every time we do the Eucharist. So we've talked in here before that Episcopalians, as Anglican Christians, do not subscribe to the idea of transubstantiation. So the old way of understanding, the Orthodox and the Catholic way of understanding communion, is that the bread and the wine are brought forward, they're put on the altar, the priest says the prayers, and the bread and the wine, their actual substance changes, a transubstantiation. The substance of the bread and the wine, even though they look like bread and wine, is now permanently changed. It has become flesh and blood, even though it doesn't look it. And that's an old Greek philosophical idea. Anglican Christians, well, I should say Protestants, believe that the bread and the wine fully stay the bread and the wine. We just remember that Jesus did this with his disciples. And so if you go to a Methodist church or Presbyterian church or Baptist, whenever they do communion, it is a remembrance. They're doing it because Jesus said, do this in remembrance of me. And so they do it. They do it occasionally. Most Protestant churches don't do it very often. You might get it once a quarter, once a semester, something like that. We fall, surprise, in the middle. And part of what we believe is that it takes our faith to consume the bread and the wine for it to become flesh and blood to us. That is called real presence. That's the kind of Anglican way of understanding communion. I can say a prayer over the bread and the wine. And we believe that the bread and the wine is now representative of the sacrament of Eucharist. It is holy, but it is not in its substance something other than bread and wine. But because it has been made holy, when we as believers consume them, it becomes to us the flesh and blood of Christ. And it nourishes us in a very real way. Different than just a remembrance. That's all I can do for you right now. I don't have enough time. Okay, so just say, yeah, that sounds cool. Okay, thanks. So the same kind of thing is happening here. It takes the action of the people listening to what Jesus said to actually realize what Jesus has promised. So that water becomes wine because they act. They do what Jesus actually said. And the big problem for us is that means we have to actually do what Jesus says. Dang. I know, just when you thought you could get out of it, nope. And so just in the same way that the people there help to realize the promise of Christ, we are the same way as disciples. If we don't act, if we don't do the things Jesus said, then Jesus is not going to force the transformation on the world. Through our actions, the transforming power bringing heaven and earth together takes place. And that gives us a lot of responsibility. And that's part of what a church community is all about when we raise each other up and call us to higher responsibility, hold one another accountable. When a friend of yours here calls you because you haven't been in church for the last 3 weeks, they're not being a jerk. They're actually calling you to accountability, to actually do the thing that Jesus said to do. When people call you and say, hey, you've not forgiven that person, they're not trying to be nosy. They're trying to raise you up to understand that it's in the act of forgiving, it's in the act of service, it's in the act of love, it's in the act of giving, that we actually bring about the reality and the transforming power of Christ in the world, and we bring heaven and earth closer together. All right, any questions about that? Do I have to do what Jesus said? Yes. Okay.
It seems to me in the Bible, my understanding is you use the numbers 7 and 12 constantly to reference completeness, but there are 6 water vessels, and I'm just wondering if the writer is suggesting there's something not complete in the story.
So the question is about using numbers to represent something holy or not. And so numerology is certainly present in Scripture. In the Old Testament, you hear 12s and 40s everywhere, and then multiples of those. And so we get a lot of the 3, 7, 12, 40. I mean, those are some of the holy numbers. And so we hear a lot of those all the time. I think a couple weeks ago in the gospel lesson about forgiveness, one of the disciples asked, how many times am I supposed to forgive the person who hurt me? 7 times? And Jesus says 7 times 7 times, or 70 times 7 times, whatever you say. It's not about the number, don't do the math. It's just about saying it's holy to forgive, and you forgive every time. That's it. So your question about 6 water jugs, I'm going to tell you, well, I don't know, but I'm going to tell you that I think that's probably reading more into the number than we should. I will look this up, but I'm not so certain John is big on the numbers. Tim, do you know, does John use numbers like that? I'm thinking all the examples I can think of for like 7s and 40s and 12s and stuff like that mostly come from the synoptics.
No, he uses 3, 7, and 12.
He does use them?
Yes.
I'm going to look that up then, because I don't know why it would be 6 if he has attended to those numbers in other ways. It probably is just because someone told John there were 6. But, you know, I'll see if there's somebody has written something more about that. Any other questions? Yeah.
Sorry, I was going to say, I've heard that 6 is the number of man, so maybe.
6 is the number of man? Okay, so maybe you've got 6 there to represent something human becoming something transformed. I like that. That's a good answer. So, and there it is. So, yes, officially that is the answer. Okay. All right, let's get to and that is how certain things become authoritative. Because somebody said, well, I heard once that 6 is, and that sort of thing. And then everyone's like, 10 years from now, everyone's like, that's what 6 means. That's the water jugs. So that's why we do not take too much stock in whatever somebody once said. Okay. Let's go to section 3, cleansing the temple. The story of cleansing the temple is one of only a handful of stories actually found in all 4 Gospels. So there are only a few of the components of Jesus' story that are found in all 4. And so most of the time when I see one of those stories on a Sunday morning, I will actually lean much harder into that story than others, because if all 4 Gospels put the same story in, I take that as that's an important story. There are other nice stories, and it doesn't mean that they're not helpful, but if John tells one story that the synoptics don't tell, okay, I'll use it a little, and then we'll jump off from there. But if something like this, I might preach the entire time on the actual cleansing of the temple, because if all 4 thought it mattered that much, then it probably should matter to us more. So let's try to dig in a bit on what is happening in this story. So first off, when did this actually happen in Jesus' lifetime? In the Gospel of John, obviously it happens at the very beginning. When you go to the synoptics, it happens after the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And of course, in the synoptics, the triumphal entry we understand as Palm Sunday, and within days Jesus is dead. And so it's very different the way that John tells the story. It's at the very beginning. And we already said that in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus' ministry really is about 1 year. Whereas in John, Jesus' ministry is 3 years, maybe even 4 years, depending on how many Passovers you count. And so Jesus does this, and then he keeps teaching for years in a way that is totally different than how the Synoptics use the cleansing of the temple story. Could it have happened multiple times? Sure. But probably that's not really the case. John is using this story in a very particular way. The Synoptic Gospels use this story as saying, that's it. That is the final straw. It is the last thing Jesus does that really pushes the leadership over the edge, and now they want him dead. That's really not how John uses this story. John uses this story as another stepping stone in building the case that Jesus is doing something totally new. And we're going to see that made explicit in this story. So let's look starting in verse 13. The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. Making a whip of cords, he drove all of them out of the temple, both the sheep and the cattle. He also poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. He told those who were selling the doves, "Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The Jews then said to him, "What sign can you show us for doing this?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "This temple has been under construction for 46 years, and you will raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking of the temple of his body. After he was raised from the dead, the disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. And so, just in case you miss what John is saying, he tells you very plainly. So this story is very profoundly resetting the expectation of where God is in the world. Let's talk about the temple. The temple's history is relatively clear. In the wilderness of Sinai, when Moses takes all of the Jewish people, well, I shouldn't say that, all of the Israelites out of Egypt, and they go to Sinai, they receive the 10 Commandments, they begin the path to becoming Jewish. Part of that is that the commandments went into the ark, and the ark went into the tent, and the tent was where God touched the earth. And we had the pillars of light and cloud that would go with the tent as they would move all the way around in the wilderness. That continued until David brought the ark to Jerusalem and Solomon built the first temple. So we might recall that from last year. That temple that Solomon built housed the ark in the Holy of Holies, in the inner sanctum. And it was believed that in the ark, in the temple, was where God physically touched the earth. God was not in our hearts. That was not happening at this time. God was in the temple. And so good Jews went to the temple to see God. Obviously, that first temple was destroyed. The Jews went into exile. It was rebuilt. And the second temple is the temple Jesus is walking into right now. That second temple was made much bigger than the first temple. The temple's function for the Jewish people when they came was to essentially make an offering to God that would keep them in the right place. So Judaism, kind of writ large, was you need to show up at least once a year and say you're sorry for all the stuff, and then you'll be forgiven, and then God will be with you. If you don't do that, God will not be with you, and good luck. So Jews would come to the temple, and they would do things like pay taxes. That was one of the things that they would do. And they would also make sacrifices. What Jesus walks into is not some den of mischief or horror. I mean, this is not like, a prostitution or some bloodletting or weird thing. Well, it was actually literally bloodletting, but it was of animals. And so the idea here is that this isn't something horrible that Jesus is walking into. Some of the art that you see representing the cleansing of the temple makes it look like Jesus is walking into some dark, dingy, terrible scene. That's not really what we get from John. What we get from John is probably just any day at the temple. Because as people are coming, they need to pay their taxes and make a sacrifice. They're coming from all over the place. We might be tempted to think that all the Jews lived in Israel. That's not true at all. There were Jews all over the place. We know that from Paul. Paul was born in Turkey to a Jewish family. So there were Jews all over the place. But they would all kind of make a pilgrimage to the temple. And when they did, they needed to pay taxes. Well, if you're going to go pay taxes in a country in which you do not live, what do you have to do? You have to change money. Just like we would if we were going out of the U.S., we've got to turn the dollars into what? You need some pounds, you need some yen, you need whatever you need. And so these people would bring their cash to the temple and they would exchange the money so that they could actually get the currency that they used in Jerusalem to pay their taxes. Okay, not so bad, right? And if they're coming from a long way, they also would like to make a sacrifice. And it is a whole lot easier to buy an animal in Jerusalem to sacrifice than it is to bring your animal all the way with you. And so what's really happening in this marketplace is it's kind of like a convenience store. It's sort of like a one-stop shop where you can exchange money, you can buy a dove or a goat or whatever, and then you can get all your business done. Because this is not romantic. People did not have this sense of God loves me, I need to go light a candle. I mean, it really wasn't sweet. The Jews were checking boxes, okay? And that's okay, because the Judaism is much more about action than belief. And so they had certain things they had to do in order to stay good with God. And so they're showing up, they're changing the money to pay their taxes, to buy the animal, to sacrifice the animal, and then they're good for the year. they're not bad people for this. It's just, it became functional. What Jesus does when he walks in is he says, this misses the whole point. That is not what this is all about. And so he's not really taking aim at the people. He's taking aim at the system that has been created to teach people that God does not need them. God just needs them to do some stuff. And that misses the whole point. And so as Jesus is turning over these tables, Jesus is also turning over the idea that God doesn't want our hearts. God just wants us to check boxes. And then when the leaders come to him and say, what is the sign you can show us for doing all of this? What they're really saying is, Jesus must be kind of understood as a teacher at this point, and I have a little note about that in a second. Jesus must be understood as a teacher in some way, because they come to him and they say, what sign can you show us for doing what you did? In other words, you are a teacher in some way, and so the actions you're taking must have some point or purpose. Can you show us in the prophets, or can you show us in the law, or can you show us in our history what would defend your action? And Jesus says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And of course they're like, you are nuts. We've been working on this temple for decades. It is gigantic. There's no way you could do this in 3 days. And what Jesus says is, he is not speaking of the temple as a place. He's speaking of the temple as his body. And in this moment, what John is really saying to us is everything Jesus has come to do changes the reality of what people thought God had been doing. God is no longer restricted to a single physical place, the temple. God is now embodied in a person, and embodied in that person to then allow us to embody God's presence in our own person. And so the idea of the Spirit is now that God is in us. And so the best of us says, God is not in this building, God's in each of us. The church is the people in the building. Now, yes, of course, a place can be sacred, but God's physical presence is now in the creation. God's physical presence is now in us as believers, not limited to one building in one place. That's ultimately why Christians don't really care as much about physical space as other religious groups. You know, when you think of, let's just use Jerusalem, when you think of Israel, Jerusalem, that the Holy Land, Christians aren't really part of the fight. It's really Jews and Muslims that are fighting over that land, which is why 70 years ago, 80 years ago, when Israel was founded, half of Israel was Christian. Today, it's less than 2%. Because Christians are kind of like, listen, you can have it. It's really not worth all this. Because God's not just here. God's wherever we are. And so if it's really going to come down to you kill us over this, okay, you can have it. It's really okay. That's just not the same in these other traditions. And that's important for us to understand. One last note. John knows that Jesus is garnering a lot of attention. I imagine that when we read this story, a question that pops up in many minds is, why was he not arrested for this? I mean, it's the temple, for God's sake. There are a lot of different ideas that have been thrown out for this. One idea is John is not literally intending to make this a historic account. And so maybe Jesus was arrested. John just leaves that out because it's not that important, theologically speaking. I think a better way of understanding this is that at some point, Jesus has garnered enough attention from enough people that the leaders likely thought arresting him would cause a riot. I like that interpretation because Jesus just comes in and busts some stuff up and then walks away. He probably couldn't do that anywhere, especially in the temple, unless there was some perception of Jesus being a crowd favorite, doing something like this as a teaching mechanism, and so therefore arresting him would have drawn more attention to him than he already had. And so they made a calculation to just let him go, because that would end up being simpler for them. That actually makes a decent amount of sense in the flow of John's gospel, because it does take a while in John's story, years, for the leaders to finally say, that's enough. This implies that Jesus got away with a lot of stuff because it was weakness of leadership, or it was a calculated risk that allowing him to go off and do these things occasionally would draw less attention to him than if he were arrested or martyred. And finally, that just plays out and they decide to jump. So I'll leave you with that idea for today. And as we continue on, do read ahead. It is very helpful. And I look forward to seeing you all next week. Have a great week.